Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Yesterday I spoke to my friend Kaveh Mousavi, a writing colleague at Only Sky. He's Iranian, and we spoke about the situation with the protests in Iran, the political situation, the geopolitical situation. We touched a little bit on Ukraine and Russia. We touched upon American politics and how that interacts with where Iran are at the moment and how they progress going forwards. Really fascinating discussion, this. We had trouble actually speaking because there are so many platforms that we couldn't use that we could speak on because Iran have shut those platforms down. So I've done this through one particular platform. Unfortunately, you just get to look at my face. He can't be seen on this. He couldn't be seen anyway. It can't show his name or his true name or his face. So this is Kaveh Mousavi, an Iranian friend of mine. See what you think. Let me know in the comments. Hi there, and thank you so much, Kaveh, for agreeing to speak to me about Iran. We have had such a lot of news hitting us over the last, bunch of months with regard to Iran. However, it's been somewhat drowned out by what's been going on in Ukraine. And so it's taken, unfortunately, a backseat because this is something that maybe the world has been waiting for a long time, that kind of potential liberalization, democratization of Iran on the horizon. You'll let me know whether that's a realistic aspiration. But first of all, do you want to just give as much information that you can about, yourself and give a real sort of layman's primer for what is taking place in Iran at the moment and has been recently?
I'm a fellow writer on Only Sky. I'm an expert on politics, and I work inside Iran. So that is why I'm not here with my real name and real face. But apart from that, I can say that the current situation has its roots in developments that happened a very long time ago, maybe even before I was born. But the current bout of protests happened when the morality police, which is a kind of patrolling police that tries to force modesty codes on women. They killed a young Kurdish woman. This actually wasn't the first instance of violence in the early months of this president's administration, but this one basically caught the attention of the whole nation, and this soon escalated to a series of protests that went far beyond asking for the repeal of modesty laws, and they basically asked for the overthrow of the entire government and the system of governance or the regime. So I think the protests have basically mostly abated from now, and we are in the episode where the regime is taking revenge. Some people have been executed. Many people are going to prison. Of course, no one feels that the situation is normal on the ground at the moment. Like every night you can still hear people shouting slogans from the rooftops, but in general, there are no active protests going on at the moment. But I think any Iranian can feel that it's only a matter of time and we are sitting on a powder keg.
So there's a couple of questions to ask in response to that, which is, first of all, what was the trigger that these protests had that made them more I don't know, effective and larger and cut across society more greatly than previous, protests. We had previous protests a couple of years ago, didn't we? We didn't you? So, what was different about these protests? How did they capture the nation more significantly?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't necessarily think these protests were larger. Like, I think that the largest protests still are those that happened in 2009 after they rigged the election in favor of the incumbent president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But um, why these basically attracted more attention? I think the most important point was that Iran is in a very vulnerable position right now because of the economic sanctions, the inability of the current president to resurrect the nuclear deal. So everyone feels like it is a more momentous episode because basically the regime is as its weakest. Of course, I don't mean to imply that it's about to crumble, but the protests came at a more dangerous moment, shall we say. And yes, we did have a couple of massive protests back in 2019, but the difference is that those were protests that were purely economic and were organized by the working classes. This recent episode saw the return of the middle class to the streets. And of course, the international media is inherently more sympathetic towards middle class protesters rather than working class protesters. So I think two things make these recent events feel different. First, the economic context where people feel like everything is about to crumble. And second, the fact that the middle class returned to the streets again.
Yeah, so I think that's what I was sort of talking to, which is this idea of it cutting across society somewhat more than the 2019 protest because of that the appeal to the middle classes. I suppose maybe the middle class intellects, those with education that might be somewhat more liberalized as opposed to and I don't know if this is an accurate portrayal. Would that be an accurate portrayal of Iranian society, such that the working classes might be more sympathetic maybe to like the kind of morality stipulations that the morality police and laws make, and it's the middle classes that would want to be somewhat more liberal in their approach to life? Is that fair?
Well, it depends on what you mean by liberal. This is actually something that I was thinking about because when you read the Western media, you keep hearing about pro-democracy protests. This is what you hear all the time. And to be honest, I personally don't see any evidence for this.
Interesting.
I don't think that they are asking for anything beyond negative attitude toward the status quo. I don't think they are necessarily pro-democracy or anti-democracy. I don't think most protesters have actually thought about this, but there is this tendency, especially in Western media, to assume not only about Iran, but about any country where there are protests that, well, they probably want democracy. And I don't see any evidence of this. And specifically, if you are me, well, obviously you have many friends who participate in the protests. You know many people who do. You follow Persian accounts on social media. And I don't think these people are necessarily Democrats, but I think it is accurate to say that they are looking for a more liberal version of a society if you compare them with the current situation. So basically, I think what all of them agree on is, more choice when it comes to how people dress. Of course, some of them, endorse actually repressing the more religious people, which I also disagree with, obviously. But I think they do want a more secular and more liberal society. I don't know necessarily if they want a more liberal form of governance. And it seems that they are basically coalescing around this figure of Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the Shah, who was overthrown in the 1979 revolution. Now, I have to be transparent. Reza Pahlavi says that he wants democracy and he says that he doesn't want to restore the monarchy, but many people don't take him at his word when he says that. So, what I mean is that it's basically a coalition which does include some anti democratic elements and some pro democratic elements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you want to give just a snapshot? Because I was going to ask, have you've kind of insinuated that that the society is returning back to normal somewhat, as in there's a question about whether these protests will have lasting effect. But before I get there, can you just give us a snapshot of where Iran is now, politically speaking, as in terms of who your president leaders are, and how that has shifted in the last 5 or 10 years, if it has at all?
Donald Trump became president and he withdrew from the nuclear deal. And this basically caused our economy to begin to crumble. Um, when Joe Biden was elected, I think that the conservative faction of the regime basically stopped the Hassan Rouhani, who was the moderate president, from returning to the nuclear deal because they wanted to make sure that they would regain the presidency in the next election. And this happened. So this very conservative, radical cleric called Ebrahim Raisi became president. So what we have now is that all the power is consolidated in the hands of radical conservatives, from the supreme leader to the president to the parliament. So what happened was that they basically stopped the previous president from making the situation better, and this caused the turnout to go down a lot in parliamentary elections and the presidential elections. And they used this to return to power, and now they have all the power, but they are not doing anything with it. So the economy is getting worse. The satisfaction with the political situation is getting worse. There is no asset that's getting better. And this is the situation which was the context to these protests.
Which is interesting because then, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on the Ukraine war and Russia, and there's been this closening of ties between Russia and Iran. And that can be seen, I guess, in the context of Iran having no other options. Like, economically speaking, they're in trouble. And if the conservative government aren't going to go back to the drawing board and restart the the nuclear negotiations again, then the only other option is to befriend the enemies of people who are advocating that kind of direction, which would be, Russia, perhaps China. And so getting into bed with these sort of regimes, and lo and behold, that's what we've seen. Is maybe do you know if the government in Iran see, say, Russia as a way of accessing, a better economic outlook?
First of all, let me compliment you on your work on Russia and Ukraine. I've been closely following you, and I think you've done excellent work, and I've learned a lot from you.
Oh, thank you.
Secondly, yeah, I wish it was only that. I wish it was only that they see no other option than Russia. But the fact is that these people love Russia. They love Putin. They think that he's the best thing that has happened in the world. So it's not limited to a marriage of convenience, as you could say. It's basically an ideological alliance. Of course, this is absurd because if you look at Iran's history, Russia has a long colonial history in Iran, and they have hurt us more than the UK or the US. But these in their ideologies, they are so staunchly anti-American that they cling to anyone who is opposed to the US.
So is that to say the commonalities then between Russia and Iran aren't so much that, because at the end of the day, Russia is, well, previously an atheistic nation, but now using the Orthodox Russian Church to achieve its very, I guess, conservative goals. So maybe there's a commonality of conservatism. There's a commonality of authoritarian regime, but I don't know that there's any particular positive correlation, particularly in sort of religious content and whatnot. So is it just that? Is it like these guys are conservative? They are they are strongman authoritarian regimes, which might be quite similar to Iran, and also they hate the people we hate.
It is that, but I don't know how into the weeds we can get here. But I think that if you look at the most important ideologue and quote unquote philosopher of the Russian regime, who is Alexander Dugin,
Yeah.
he's very influential among this current generation of Iranian ultra conservatives too,
Oh.
in that I think he's basically his, unholy alliance of a kind of relativistic thinking, which leads to a fascist ideology, is very popular among Iranian conservatives. And I think this is the result of a loss of legitimacy based on the original, promises of the Iranian Revolution, which was a very populist revolution. Like in Iranian context, we consider people like Khomeini, who was the leader of the previous revolution, to be a leftist, basically. But they have been unable to realize this dream, these basic Islamic values. So what they have been forced to do is to embrace these new philosophies that basically, of course, I myself am a nihilist too, but this nihilistic vision of nothing matters, so let us be, these radical versions of ourselves, which I think was popularized by Dugin in the modern world. So they are basically taking a lot of influence from the Russian regime beyond having a common enemy.
Wow, that's fascinating. Goodness me, yeah, and there could be an opportunity to get into some very long weeds there. Well, so going back to the protests then, have they been a flash in a pan, a very painful flash in a pan for some, and you say that you're now going through a phase of executions, which we are hearing somewhat about, and it's absolutely terrible. But does it mean that well, that's that. It's now been done. It's over, and now Iran's going to move forward just as it was previously, or will it enforce some kind of change at all?
Well, I don't think anyone thinks that Iran can just move on because, you know, um, just think about a scenario where the regime is forced to increase the price of petroleum. It's completely possible that the working classes come to the street again, and then the middle classes might join them for the first time. Or imagine that if the current supreme leader dies, and then in the chaos that ensues, we have massive protests. I think what we see is that people have returned to their homes, but there hasn't been any convincing, any step toward satisfying them, starting a dialogue with them, reaching a kind of deal with them. And in fact, things are getting worse in some aspects. So I don't think anyone who lives here has any sense of normalcy or a return to the, pre protest situation. I think everyone believes that any small event can, start the chaos again. So no, I don't think that they're over by any means.
So you think there's this kind of bubbling unease that's going on that could be, that could be reignited at any moment.
Yeah, if you just look at the public mood, I don't remember people being so dissatisfied, so angry, and I don't think that anything has happened to dissipate this. I feel like of course, this is something that people don't pay much attention to, but I think we have a mental illness, a pandemic at the moment. And I think more and more people are becoming, in a way, even suicidal, because this is something that I wanted to make sure that I say.
Mm.
The main danger of the regime change at this moment is the danger of civil war, the danger of widespread political instability. So I think even people who do ask for regime change, many of them don't feel like there is a positive vision for Iran after. So people feel like they're in this between a rock and a hard place. The rock is, of course, a regime that's getting worse and worse every day, more and more aggressive and indifferent to public opinion every day. On the other hand, we saw what happened in Syria and Iraq after their central regimes had problems or fell. And we know Iran could be much worse than both those scenarios. So this is the situation at the moment.
So, um, what part of society then does support the government? Obviously, they must have some kind of support.
Yeah, I think they definitely have some kind of support, but I don't think that even their supporters are, blind to the current situation. Like,
Mm.
if you listen to them, you hear only two kinds of justifications for regime and its behavior at the moment. One is nakedly violent. It says we can, repress you, and we will. Of course, these people who say this are in a small minority, but I think they are more powerful and more involved in day-to-day repression. And then the other supporters of the regime basically just say that, yes, we are bad, yes, we have problems, but the United States is worse. And they try to, of course, make a mountain out of the molehill of things like police shootings of Black people, which, of course, is a tragedy. I don't mean to minimize those, but they basically point toward the problems that exist in Western societies, and then they claim those are worse. So choose us as the bad option between bad and worse, which is, of course, complete nonsense. Every person who's a little familiar with the situation knows that. But I think that even when you look at regime supporters, you see a huge loss of legitimacy in comparison with, you know, maybe 8 years ago, where they had a much more positive argument for their support.
I was going to talk about sort of content there. Is it just about naked power, or do they have a positive vision of what Iran should be? Is their positive vision merely just kind of religious conservatism, or do they have a plan for the future? Your current government. I mean, where are they at in terms of what they are putting on the table?
I have an article on Only Sky. I want to recommend it and plug it to your viewers.
Hmm.
It's about Ibrahim Raisi. The title is something like "The Banality of Evil Meet the Probable Next Supreme Leader of Iran," something like this. And you know, on the regime level, I believe that they have absolutely no vision for the future. Like, they are completely trapped in the, making it to the next day, and there is nothing beyond that. They don't have an economic strategy. They don't have a coherent worldview. And on the discourse level, on the society, again, I think it's completely negative. Like, keep supporting us, or they will bring gay people to Iran. Of course, gay people are already here, but they don't want you to know that. They say, support us, or they will basically bring all of these negative Western, depraved values to
It's
Iran.
really
So
interesting because that's very similar to the kind of rhetoric you hear in Russia at the moment, in terms of like if Ukraine win, if the West wins, then they'll take your children away and they'll become gay, and all this kind of like super culture wars narrative that's been amplified to the most ridiculous level. But you actually see the propagandists on Russian TV say this in very clear terms, and it's fascinating to hear that is kind of replicated, or it's the same thing in Iran. It's fascinating.
yeah, and of course it doesn't work because people are much more concerned with their economic situation right
Mm.
now than and of course having some basic rights that the Russians already do have, like being able to dress the way they want, being able to go to the parties, go to the pubs, discos, things like this. So the main difference is that it's really hard to sell to Iranian people the Western societies as these depraved societies, because, well, they have things that the majority of people really want. And things like, LGBT rights are far removed from a point that Iranians start to care about. People basically compare themselves to the basic day-to-day life in Western societies rather than these culture war contexts. So
It's
I
it's
think,
fast. Sorry, I was just going to interrupt. It's
yeah.
fascinating because in American politics over the last a couple of election cycles, the Democrats have accused the GOP, and I actually think this is correct, of not having any positive vision of what America should be, as in policies. So the GOP came to the table in the last election with basically no policies, and that they had. And when they were questioned directly on that, they actually couldn't say what policies they had. I've seen many news pieces where they were literally like, "What are your policies?" And then they would just return to the culture wars again and say, "Well," so it's arguing about what America shouldn't look like with the scaring Americans in terms of these culture war narratives. And that's exactly what you were talking about there, which is like we don't have a positive vision of what Iran should look like. We don't have an economic model of what we would like Iran to be, but we're going to scare you with these ideas of culture wars that are just not relevant to, or not important to most people, but will scare the conservative types into getting out and voting, being mobilized, I guess.
Well, I think the difference is that Republicans actually do have an economic vision. The difference is that their economic vision is incredibly unpopular, and if they ran on it, they would lose really badly. Things like cutting social security, cutting Medicaid, having a flat sales tax while eliminating income tax, basically being pro wealthy people. But I don't think that Iranian regime right now really doesn't have any vision. Like, if you ask me or really anyone whether our president is a populist or a free market guy, this should be an easy question to answer. But I don't think anyone knows this, and he himself basically ran as this populist in the previous election in 2017 election, and when he became president, he sounded like a deficit hawk. So I think the difference is that Republicans are trying to hide their real agenda, while Iranian conservatives really don't have an actual
Interesting.
agenda.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a very astute observation, I guess. So, where do you think Iran goes now? Then, I mean, what are your predictions over the next sort of months? Because the other question I was going to ask is, given all of these executions, are you seeing executions in Iran, sorry, of key players in the protest movement, as in, or are they just people that have been rounded up off the streets who might be very vocal and doing bad things in terms of the government, but aren't really important in the large scheme of like mobilizing opposition? So do you have key opposition figures that are active in Iran, and are they being sort of executed or rounded up? And what does this say about the future? What are your predictions?
To answer your second question first,
Mhm.
no major figure has been executed in the era of the current supreme leaders. So it has always been ordinary people who might have actually committed small acts of violence. But of
Mm.
course, execution is a very disproportionate punishment for that. For example, the first person who was executed was this young boy who had, stabbed one Basiji, a paramilitary member, whose wounds were so superficial that he hadn't even needed stitches. But because of these very strict laws that even brandishing a weapon leads to your execution, he was executed, and it makes it very tragic. But I think that the regime is very careful about executing people to scare other ordinary people without doing something that would lead to worse crises.
Right.
As for where Iran is going at the moment, still, I believe everything depends on the nuclear deal. So now that the situation is calmer, and is it possible for them to finally go to the negotiating table and revive the deal? If yes, I think then we can be a little bit optimistic about the future. Of course, not by much, because that wouldn't be enough. That would just be a first step. But if they continue to, delay getting back to the deal and lifting some of the sanctions, well, this economic situation will get worse, and people will continue to get dissatisfied, and either we will have a failed state before the protest can manage to off the regime, or we will finally have a moment of weakness for the central government, which would lead to massive violence. Because in addition to Iran having many tribes, much more than Syria and Iraq, which would demand at least autonomy, if not separation, without the Islamic Republic, which might lead to a number of civil wars. We have about 15 million people who are supporters of the regimes, and they are armed. So I don't know how they would allow a peaceful transition into the next government, I think they won't, because they are ideologically fervently in favor of the regime. They are all of their economic interest is tied with the regime. They have positions of employment, positions of power. So the future is very bleak, uh, at
But
least in the short term.
But in one sense, so if you say, right, if the nuclear deal's back on the table, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but if the nuclear deal gets back on the table, then maybe we can make these small inroads into improving Iran and so on and so forth. But actually, in the long run, that might not be as beneficial as actually having a failed state and starting again. Do you know what I mean? So if it gets to the, and I know this is harsh because you're using people instrumentally for as a means to an end, but if you have this situation where, okay, the deal isn't on the table, the economy gets worse, it tanks, then you get to this desperate situation where actually that's more likely to foment an uprising that will change the regime, rather than going this kind of trying to navigate this path in between those things. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you need to get worse before it eventually gets better?
Well, setting aside that I think the human cost will be too steep to justify most
Yeah,
things,
yeah.
like who is taking power after that, economic collapse? Uh, like the current opposition would be, I think, would be unable to, take power because they are not armed, while the supporters of the regime are armed. And
Mm,
I don't think that the US and the West is, willing to arm them. And I don't know if it was willing, it would have been a good situation. And
mm,
this is actually something really important, because I think the Islamic Republic has unwittingly engineered this situation where, our only two options is to putting up with it, or to accept a kind of apocalyptic collapse of the society. And this has caused, I think, a situation where, even now that it seems like reform is completely hopeless, even now, I think the best politicians are basically silent and are sitting at their homes. And the opposition leaders, if you look at them, it's a prince of a previously collapsed regime. It's a football player. They are actresses. Like, you don't see a real alternative to the current regime among the elites of the society. And I think this makes the situation more hopeless.
So going back, I mean, we talked some years ago when I was having my treatment, stem cell therapy in Moscow of all places. We talked. I think you were quite hopeful about Rouhani at the time, as in he's not perfect, but there's some kind of he was a moderate, and the nuclear deal, etc., etc. But of course, then Trump came along. I don't want to be like super anti-Trump here, as many people know I I have an inclination to be. But what was this a key moment in setting Iran backwards? As in when he like ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, was that a really bad moment, or how do you see that in from your perspective?
I would say that if in 2016 Hillary Clinton had become president, Iran would be in a very good position right now. But at the same time, I don't want to put the main blame on Trump for what happened, because I think what was more important was Iran's reaction to Trump rather than Trump himself. So basically, what we saw in the case of North Korea as well, Trump was willing to negotiate even with what he considered his enemies. So when Trump was president, Iran was completely unwilling to allow Rouhani to negotiate. And I know that he tried really hard to basically get permission to do the negotiations, but he didn't receive them. And then when Joe Biden became president, we had like about 8 months left in Rouhani's presidency, but they basically blocked him completely from negotiating. And if they had allowed Rouhani to revive the nuclear deal during those 8 months, again, we would be in a much better position now. So while I do think that Trump was a very important turning point, and I do think that what he did was a very awful decision, but I still think that the main responsibility goes to the Iranian regime for not reacting in a wise and prudent manner to the threat of Trump.
So that's a really interesting nuance to reply there. So on the one hand, this was a terrible thing that happened, Trump getting rid of the Iran nuclear deal. But then on the other hand, the reaction of Iran to that was, compounded the issue, and in fact continued on into Biden's rule. And then, you're in a situation now where, are you in a situation now where you think that is the only viable option out of this mess, at least as far as your economy and international cooperation is concerned?
Yeah, so basically, I have always called this a Faustian bargain because I think the conservatives, they weren't really opposed to the idea of reviving the nuclear deal, but they wanted to have power to themselves. So they basically blocked the moderates from actually doing it. And yes, the simple fact is that
Why did they? So why did they block the moderates from doing? What's their reasoning? Is it again goes back to sort of naked power? Kind of, we don't like the West and the rest of the world, so we don't want to go to the table with them, and we'd much rather be this insular nation where we can fully control everything. Was that the reasoning?
In part, yes, but basically, it was much more pedestrian than that. A presidential election was coming up, and they knew if that the major, in Iran, if you have high turnout, the conservatives will lose. This is a fact.
So
And
this is pretty much the same in a number of countries, actually. Yeah.
And they knew that if the people were satisfied with the direction of the country, or even if they were dissatisfied, but they saw some realistic hope that it would get better, they would still not vote for them, and they would vote for another moderate option. And even though they did stop the Rouhani administration from reviving the deal, they still didn't allow the main candidate of the moderate faction to run, because they were scared that even in that very awful situation, they would still lose. So it was that they just wanted to win a presidential election. And of course, when they did, they were, like the dogs who caught the car. When they did win, they found out that they don't have any other commonality other than hating the moderates. Some of them were populists, some of them were free market extremists, some of them were, they said we should, allow people to dress how they want and instead build a nuclear weapon. Others said we should do everything the liberals want, but make sure that hijab is still enforced. So they were these groups of people who didn't agree on anything other than stopping the moderates from getting into power. And now they can't do anything because they have this coalition of, contradictory ideas. And as to your original question about whether I see any other option, well, I think I, entered political analysis in a serious way in 2014, 2015. And Since then, I have consistently seen the only option for Iran to fix its international situation to
Oh, you've
reintegrate,
gone muffled again. Can you? The only option for Iran is
to fix its international situation,
yeah,
and to integrate into the global economy. So without that, I don't think democratic reform is possible. I think right now Iran is like a patient with advanced cancer, and before that problem is resolved, none of the other problems will be resolved either, because right now we're on a dichotomy between survival and destruction.
interesting, fascinating. So really, the main goal, as far as you see it, is the Iran nuclear deal to give you a platform with which to interact with the wider globe to get the kind of economic interaction going, and through economic stimulus you start getting people being happier with their lives and start, it's the idea that kind of globalization is a way of changing people. This was the approach with kind of Merkel and the EU with Putin, which is we don't change him by saying we're going to have nothing to do with you, and putting them at arm's length and saying, right, you go over there, we'll stay over here because you're a naughty boy type thing. It's like, okay, come over here, we'll interact with you and we'll change you by you being involved very closely with the operations of the EU. That didn't work as it happened, and but I actually think that that's a right kind of approach. But it didn't work with Putin. But you're saying that's a sort of approach that would work with Iran, which is, bring them into the global fold and change them by those means.
Well, the difference between Putin's regime and Iran's regime is that the person who at the top of the regime has a much weaker monopoly on the power in Iran. So
Right.
if interactions with Iran happen, what would happen is that in the next step, moderates who want to do other reforms as well will come to power. This is inevitable. And of course, I don't think that the current situation in the world is different for Iran. I don't think that Biden doesn't want to do the sensible thing with Iran. I don't think that Olaf Scholz or Rishi Sunak don't want to do the correct thing. The Iranian conservatives are basically isolating Iran because they know that globalization and removal of isolation is synonymous with other reforms that would weaken them further.
Right. Yeah. So this is just again, it goes back to naked power. How do they continue to maintain their power? And that is by taking the course of action, the sort of course of actions that they're taking. Interesting. Well, look, I my time has come to an end, but look, I really appreciate this, Kaveh. I really appreciate the time you spent with me, and I would love to speak to you again on developments in Iran and other things that are relevant to this conversation. Where can people find you? Where do you want to point people towards?
First of all, let me say that I love talking to you at all. You are one of my favorite people on the internet, and I'm really honored and happy to call you a friend. And people can find me on
Oh,
Only
thanks, mate.
Sky. And other than Only Sky, they can also find me on Facebook. So that's it.
Excellent. Well, I point people towards Kaveh Mousavi and his writing at Only Sky, where we are colleagues, writing colleagues. So, look, thank you so much for your kind words, Kaveh. And look, it's just I just can't imagine what it'd be like to live in a place like you live and not be able to express yourself. Like how we are communicating now has been quite a journey on like, okay, it's only taken a day, but we've been unable to communicate on so many different platforms due to the things put in place by Iran that disallow free and open conversation, and just not being able I have such a privilege of being able to express myself in any way that I want, broadly speaking. I've been cancelled twice in the UK due to my non-religious tendencies, but that's a whole other conversation. But broadly speaking, nowadays I am free to say what I like, and that is wonderful. And yet for someone like yourself who has so much to say on so many topics, being unable to do so, I mean, is that deeply frustrating for yourself?
Yeah. Basically, I think I have, gotten much worse mentally just because of the ways that I have to struggle with connecting to the internet. And even, to do my job, like uh, everyone in Iran works for the government in one way or another. And I think that, all right, I'm doing you a service and you are making it frustrating for me by closing down half of the internet and making it a huge struggle to bypass your own filters in order to do you a service. And how frustrating is that?
Massive. Well, look, best of luck to you, and I hope things take a turn for the better, politically speaking, in Iran. And just massive thanks for you spending the time with me, mate.
Thank you very much for talking with me.